In the dim mists of the 9th century, the land that would one day be called England was not a single, unified kingdom. It was, a fractured mosaic of smaller Anglo-Saxon realms, each with its own king, its own customs, and, its own fears. The greatest of these fears came from the sea, carried on the longships of the Vikings. These Norse raiders, often called the Great Heathen Army, descended upon the coasts with fire and sword, seeking plunder, land, and glory. They toppled kingdoms, burned monasteries, and struck terror into the hearts of the people. One by one, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia fell, until only one remained standing against the tide: the southern kingdom of Wessex, led by a remarkable king named Alfred. Alfred was a scholar and a soldier, a man of deep faith and even deeper resolve. He understood that simply fighting battles was not enough. To save his people, he had to save their very identity. In the year 878, after years of brutal warfare that saw him driven into hiding in the marshlands of Somerset, Alfred rallied his forces for one last desperate stand. At the Battle of Edington, his army decisively defeated the Viking leader Guthrum. This victory did not expel the Vikings entirely, but forced them to the negotiating table. The resulting Treaty of Wedmore was a landmark agreement. It drew a line across England, creating a territory in the north and east known as the Danelaw, where Viking law and customs would hold sway. This peace, though hard won, gave Alfred the breathing room he needed to rebuild and fortify his kingdom. With the immediate threat contained, Alfred began the monumental task of creating a unified English identity. He reformed the army, establishing a network of fortified towns known as burhs to protect against future raids. He also championed a revival of learning and literacy, translating important Latin texts into Old English so that his people could access knowledge in their own tongue. He saw culture as a weapon, a way to bind his subjects together with a shared history and purpose. Alfred's vision was not just for Wessex, but for all the English people who lived outside the Danelaw. He laid the foundation, brick by painstaking brick, for a single unified English nation, a concept that had never truly existed before. This dream of a united England would be realized not by Alfred, but by his grandson, Athelstan. Building upon the military and cultural foundations his grandfather had laid, Athelstan was a king of immense ambition and skill. He was not content with ruling just the southern half of the country. He looked north to the Viking-controlled kingdom of Northumbria, centered on the great city of York. In 927, Athelstan marched his army north and conquered York, driving out the Norse king. For the first time, a single ruler held dominion over all the lands of the English people. He declared himself Rex Anglorum, King of the English. This was more than a title. It was the birth of England as a single political entity, a kingdom forged from the fires of Viking invasion and the unyielding will of its Saxon kings. With England now a unified and increasingly powerful kingdom, its rulers began to look beyond their own shores. Their gaze first fell upon the island next door, Ireland. A patchwork of competing Gaelic kingdoms and Norse Gaelic coastal cities, Ireland was a land of constant turmoil. In the 12th century, an internal dispute among Irish kings provided the perfect opening. An exiled Irish king, Diarmait Mac Murchada, sought help from the English monarch King Henry II. Henry, a shrewd and powerful ruler whose domains stretched across France, saw an opportunity. In 1171, he crossed the Irish Sea with a formidable army, landing at Waterford. He came not just to help an ally, but to assert his own authority over the entire island. The arrival of a king of Henry II's stature, backed by a powerful and disciplined army, was a shock to the Irish political system. Many Irish kings and bishops, perhaps seeing the futility of resistance or hoping to gain an advantage over their local rivals, chose to submit to his authority. At the Synod of Cashel in 1172, the Irish Church formally recognized Henry as the Lord of Ireland. This moment marked a profound shift. For the first time, an English monarch claimed sovereignty over Irish soil, establishing a precedent for colonial rule that would shape the troubled history between the two islands for the next 800 years. Ireland became, in effect, England's first overseas colony, a laboratory for policies of control and settlement that would later be applied across the globe. While English influence was taking root in Ireland, another neighbour was feeling the pressure of English expansion: Wales. The rugged mountainous land to the west of England was home to a proud and fiercely independent people, the Welsh. For centuries, they had resisted Anglo-Saxon and then Norman encroachment, led by powerful princes who fought to preserve their culture and their freedom. By the late 13th century, this long struggle reached its climax under King Edward I of England. Known as Longshanks, Edward was a formidable military commander with a relentless desire to bring all of Britain under his direct rule. He saw the independent Welsh principalities as a direct threat to his authority and the security of his kingdom. The final conquest of Wales began in earnest. In 1277, Edward I launched a massive invasion, overwhelming the forces of the most powerful Welsh ruler, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Prince of Wales. Llywelyn was forced to accept a humiliating treaty, but the Welsh spirit was not broken. A second, widespread uprising erupted in 1282. This time, Edward's response was merciless. Llywelyn was killed in a skirmish, and his brother Dafydd was captured and brutally executed. To secure his conquest, Edward embarked on a hugely expensive and ambitious project: the construction of a Ring of Iron, a series of massive state-of-the-art stone castles that would dominate the Welsh landscape and serve as permanent garrisons for English troops. Wales was effectively incorporated into the Kingdom of England, its laws replaced and its independence extinguished. Just as England began to project its power outward, it was dragged into a long and exhausting conflict that would consume its resources and attention for over a century. This was the 100 Years' War with France, which began in 1337. The origins of the war were complex, rooted in disputes over territory in France still held by the English crown, and, most dramatically, the English king's claim to the French throne itself. King Edward III believed he had a legitimate right to rule France, and he was willing to fight for it. This ignited a series of devastating campaigns that ebbed and flowed across generations, defining the politics and identity of both nations for decades to come, pulling England's focus away from overseas adventures. The war was a roller coaster of fortunes. England experienced stunning victories, such as the battles of Crécy and Agincourt, where English longbowmen proved devastatingly effective against the flower of French chivalry. These triumphs fueled a sense of national pride and military superiority. At one point, it seemed as if the English dream of a dual monarchy, uniting the crowns of England and France, was within reach. However, the tide eventually turned. Inspired by figures like Joan of Arc, France mounted a resurgence. The long, costly war slowly drained the English treasury and manpower. By 1453, England had lost all its French territories except for the port of Calais. The grand continental ambitions had ended in failure, leaving England an island kingdom once more, bruised and introspective. The end of the war in France did not bring peace. Instead, it created a new crisis at home. The powerful and ambitious noble families who had led armies in France now returned to England with their private retinues of soldiers. With a weak and ineffectual king, Henry VI, on the throne, these rival factions began to vie for control of the government and the crown itself. This power struggle erupted into a brutal and bloody civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. The two main rival branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the white rose, tore the country apart in a series of vicious battles and political betrayals that lasted for 30 years. This period of internal chaos was devastating for England. The nobility was decimated, the economy was disrupted, and the common people suffered greatly from the constant instability. The focus was entirely on survival and domestic power, not on exploration or overseas expansion. The dream of empire was forgotten, replaced by the grim reality of civil war. The conflict finally ended in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant, defeated the Yorkist King Richard III. Henry Tudor ascended the throne as King Henry VII, uniting the warring houses by marrying a Yorkist princess. He established the Tudor dynasty and brought a much-needed era of peace and stability to the exhausted kingdom, setting the stage for England to once again look to the world beyond its shores. While England was healing from the wounds of its internal wars, a revolution was happening on the world stage. In 1492, an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, crossed the Atlantic and stumbled upon the vast continents of the Americas. This monumental discovery ignited a firestorm of excitement and rivalry among the nations of Europe. Spain and Portugal, with their advanced ships and papal blessings, quickly began to claim vast territories and extract immense wealth from this new world. They carved up the known globe between them, leaving other aspiring nations like England watching from the sidelines with envy and ambition. England's new king, Henry VII, was a cautious and fiscally prudent ruler, more interested in rebuilding his kingdom's treasury than in funding risky overseas ventures. However, he was also a shrewd opportunist who understood the potential rewards of exploration. He listened with great interest to the proposal of another Italian adventurer, Giovanni Caboto, who was living in Bristol, England, and known to the English as John Cabot. Cabot, like Columbus, believed it was possible to reach the fabled riches of Asia by sailing west. He argued that a more northerly route would be shorter and would allow England to bypass the territories already claimed by Spain. In 1497, with a royal patent from Henry VII granting him the authority to sail to all parts, countries and seas of the east, of the west and of the north, John Cabot set sail from the port of Bristol on a small ship called the Matthew. After a perilous voyage across the stormy North Atlantic, he made landfall on June 24, 1497. The exact location is still debated by historians, but it was likely somewhere on the coast of what is now Canada, perhaps Newfoundland or Cape Breton Island. He went ashore and planted the royal banner of England, claiming the land for his patron, King Henry VII. He had not found the spices and silks of Asia, but he had found a new land teeming with forests and rich fishing grounds. Cabot's return to England was met with great excitement. Though he had not brought back gold or spices, he had proven that there were new lands to be found and claimed for England in the West. He had given England its own stake in the New World, a legal and historical claim to North America that would become the foundation for a future empire. A second, larger expedition was planned for the following year, but its fate is shrouded in mystery. Cabot and his fleet disappeared, likely lost at sea. Despite this tragic end, his initial voyage was a pivotal moment. It was the first tentative step of England into the great global race for territory, a small beginning from which a vast and powerful empire would eventually grow. The course of English history and its future as an imperial power was irrevocably altered not by a quest for land or gold, but by a king's desperate desire for a son. King Henry VIII, the second Tudor monarch, was a man of immense ego and powerful appetites. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had failed to produce a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty, giving him only a daughter, Mary. Convinced that the marriage was cursed and deeply infatuated with a charismatic lady of the court, Anne Boleyn, Henry sought an annulment from the Pope in Rome. He wanted to set Catherine aside and marry Anne, hoping she would give him the son and heir he craved. The Pope, however, was in a difficult position. He was under the political influence of Catherine of Aragon's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and refused to grant the annulment. For years, Henry pleaded, argued, and threatened, but the Vatican would not budge. Frustrated and unwilling to accept defeat, Henry VIII took a radical and unprecedented step. If the church in Rome would not give him what he wanted, he would simply remove the church in Rome from his kingdom. Aided by his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, Henry began the process of severing England's centuries-old ties to the papacy. This was a revolution driven from the top down, a political and religious earthquake. This dramatic break was formalized by a series of laws passed by what became known as the Reformation Parliament. The most significant of these was the Act of Supremacy in 1534. This act declared that the King of England was the supreme head on earth of the Church of England. In a single stroke, the Pope's authority was abolished and the King became the ultimate power in all matters, both spiritual and temporal. This English Reformation was not initially about Protestant theology. It was about power and dynastic succession. Henry went on to dissolve the wealthy monasteries, confiscating their vast lands and riches, which dramatically increased the wealth and power of the crown, and created a new class of gentry loyal to the new order. The consequences of this break with Rome were profound and far-reaching. It set England on a distinct religious and political path, different from that of Catholic powers like Spain and France. This religious difference would fuel intense national rivalries and conflicts for centuries to come, often defining England's foreign policy. The establishment of a national church, with the monarch at its head, fused religious identity with national identity. To be a loyal English subject was now increasingly tied to being a loyal member of the Church of England. This powerful fusion of patriotism and Protestantism would become a key ideological ingredient in the later justification and expansion of the British Empire, framing its competition with Catholic rivals as a struggle not just for power, but for divine truth. After the tumultuous reigns of Henry VIII's children, the devoutly Protestant Edward VI and the fiercely Catholic Mary I, the throne passed to his youngest daughter, Elizabeth I, in 1558. Elizabeth was a ruler of extraordinary intelligence, caution, and political skill. She inherited a kingdom that was religiously divided, financially weak, and threatened by the great Catholic powers of Europe, particularly Spain. One of her first and most important acts was to establish a religious settlement. Through a new Act of Supremacy in 1559, she re-established the independent Church of England, but pursued a moderate Protestantism that she hoped would be acceptable to most of her subjects. This Elizabethan settlement solidified England's identity as a leading Protestant nation. This Protestant identity immediately put England on a collision course with the most powerful nation in the world, Catholic Spain. King Philip II of Spain ruled a vast global empire, fueled by the silver and gold pouring in from his colonies in the Americas. Elizabeth's England was a small, upstart nation by comparison. Unable to challenge Spain directly through conventional warfare, Elizabeth employed a more subtle and deniable strategy. She unofficially sanctioned a generation of audacious English sailors, privateers whom the Spanish angrily called sea dogs. These men, figures like John Hawkins and Francis Drake, were part pirate, part explorer, and part naval commander, and they served the Queen's interests by disrupting Spanish trade and power. The sea dogs were instrumental in challenging Spain's monopoly in the New World. John Hawkins pioneered English involvement in the horrific transatlantic slave trade, while Francis Drake became a legend for his daring raids on Spanish colonies and treasure fleets. Between 1577 and 1580, Drake accomplished the incredible feat of circumnavigating the globe, plundering Spanish ships and settlements along the Pacific coast of the Americas along the way. He returned to England with a treasure so vast that it paid off the entire national debt and made a handsome profit for his investors, including the Queen herself. Elizabeth knighted Drake on the deck of his ship, the Golden Hind, a public act of defiance against Spanish outrage. These acts of piracy and privateering were more than just a quest for riches. They were a form of undeclared naval warfare that honed English maritime skills and emboldened the nation. The Sea Dogs' voyages provided invaluable experience in long-distance navigation, shipbuilding, and naval combat. They explored new coastlines, established new trade contacts, and nurtured a culture of seafaring adventure and aggression. This growing rivalry with Spain eventually escalated into open war, culminating in the famous defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. The victory was a huge psychological boost for England, cementing its status as a formidable sea power and clearing the way for it to pursue its own colonial ambitions without fear of Spanish dominance. By the end of Queen Elizabeth I's long reign in 1603, all the essential components for a future British Empire were in place. The nation had been forged into a single, unified kingdom with a strong sense of national identity. It had established a national church, inextricably linking Protestantism with patriotism, which provided a powerful ideological justification for rivalry with the Catholic empires of Spain and France. Through the early conquests in Ireland and Wales, England had gained its first experiences in colonization, learning brutal lessons in military subjugation, land confiscation, and the administration of a conquered people. These early, close-to-home ventures served as a grim proving ground for methods that would later be deployed on a global scale. The nation's focus had also fundamentally shifted. The failure of the 100 Years' War had turned England away from continental ambitions and toward the sea. The voyages of John Cabot had given England a claim, however tenuous, to the vast unknown lands of North America. This was a claim that sat dormant for decades, but was never forgotten. The need to find new markets for English goods, particularly wool and cloth, further encouraged merchants and adventurers to look for opportunities far beyond the shores of Europe. The establishment of trading companies, such as the Muscovy Company and the Levant Company, marked the beginning of a commercial infrastructure designed for long-distance international trade, a model that would later be perfected by the East India Company. Furthermore, England had developed the maritime muscle necessary for global expansion. The constant low-level conflict with Spain, personified by the daring raids of Elizabeth's sea dogs, had created a generation of the finest sailors and naval commanders in the world. Ship design had improved, and navigational techniques had become more sophisticated. The spectacular victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588 was not just a defensive triumph, it was a declaration that England was now a major power on the high seas, capable of protecting its own interests and challenging its rivals anywhere in the world. This new naval confidence was perhaps the single most critical ingredient for building a seaborne empire. Thus, as the 17th century dawned, the stage was set. England possessed the political unity, the religious drive, the economic ambition, and the naval power to begin its imperial journey in earnest. The first faltering steps, the unification under Athelstan, the conquests of Ireland and Wales, the break with Rome, and the defiance of Spain, had laid a deep and complex foundation. From these seeds of conflict, ambition, and adventure, a global empire would grow, one that would eventually stretch to every corner of the globe and fundamentally reshape the history of the world. The rise of the British Empire was not an accident. It was the culmination of centuries of preparation, struggle, and transformation on one small island.